This is TWiT.
Our tip, I mentioned on our last show that we have this wonderful resource, Sarah, with us on a weekly basis. So I thought we'd start giving out some tips related to Creative Commons. Creative Commons, if you weren't able to glean from our earlier discussion or have just never heard of it and are still kind of struggling with what we were talking about earlier, is this wonderful licensing strategy that was put in place. Is it 10 years ago now?
Yeah, it's more than that. I think
it's more than that. Yeah,
12 or something like that. Yeah.
Wow. Yes. Time flies. But it is a great way if you are a creator to make sure that your works reach a wide audience. And it is a great way if you are a creator who wants to use something culturally resonant or just doesn't want to use, for example, stock photography. You might be able to find something that you could use that has a Creative Commons license associated with it. So I think for our first series of Creative Commons tips, Sarah, I'd like to ask you, hey, I think a work that I want to use is Creative Commons licensed. What do I do next?
Sure. So ideally, the item will say which of the 6 types of the license is applied to it. That is not always the case. Sometimes you'll see something that just says Creative Commons licensed, and that's unfortunate because there are actually 6 different versions. And then there's also the CC0 tool, which we kind of talked about a little bit with the SpaceX, which is basically a public domain dedication. But in terms of the licenses, I think 6 can seem overwhelming and sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. So all of the licenses require attribution. So if you're reusing the work, you have to name the author, link to the work, include a copyright notice if there is one. And all of the attribution requirements are subject to kind of a reasonableness standard. So depending on the context in which you're using the work, that kind of dictates how you give attribution. So you have some flexibility there. In terms of the other license elements and what the different licenses means, it comes down to 3 things. So one, does the license allow commercial use? So we have these NC licenses, we call them, which are non-commercial purposes only. I mean, it means that you can only use the work for non-commercial purposes. We also have licenses that don't allow derivatives to be made, and those are called the ND or no derivatives licenses. And there are a couple of those, which just mean that you can just use the work as is. You can do anything, but you can't create an adaptation of it. And then for those licenses that do allow derivatives to be made, there are some that are called our share-alike licenses, which require that that if you make a derivative, you have to offer that derivative under the same license. And so that's our version of a copyleft, like free software for content. So basically it runs the gamut from the most restrictive, which is our license that's called, for the terminology we use is BY NC ND, which means attribution non-commercial no derivatives, which allows you to only use the work for verbatim use for non-commercial purposes, all the way to the least restrictive, which is the attribution license, which allows you to do anything with the work for any purpose as long as you attribute the author. So the idea is, oh, sorry.
So it's something that Andrew said earlier in the show resonates here, and that is that copyright law doesn't require attribution necessarily. Fair use, for example, doesn't require attribution if you're making all the fair use factors. So one great way to make sure that you're getting attribution is to use the CC license, because they add that in on all of them.
That's right. Although if somebody is making a fair use of a CC licensed work, they don't actually have to attribute, because the CC license doesn't apply if copyright doesn't apply. But a lot of people still do attribute just because it's a nice thing to do and it helps to know where it comes from. So,
well, and I think there's some overlap too, isn't there, between say you are doing something that would otherwise be a fair use and it's a Creative Commons licensed work, you might give the attribution or do whatever other attributes of the license are, just to make sure, just not to have any uncertainty about your fair use, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. When I worked at Stanford, actually, on the documentary film project, we advised documentary filmmakers about fair use questions. And when there was any doubt, like it was a kind of an edgy case, we would suggest using CC licensed video or photos or whatever it was, because then you're safe. So it is a nice
Right.
kind of cushion to fair use in that respect.
Great. Well, we have, thank you so much for our first Creative Commons tip. We'll have more coming your way in future shows.